If he shows up with another tiny scratch tomorrow, I'm charging him double." Emily Carter muttered with a tired smile, completely unaware that the enormous black wolf resting beside her porch understood every single word. The first rays of dawn spilled through the towering pines surrounding her little cabin, painting the dew-covered grass in soft shades of gold while birds welcomed another quiet morning in the northern forest. Emily knelt beside the animal, carefully wrapping a clean linen bandage around one powerful front paw. The wound was hardly more than a shallow scrape, certainly nothing that should have slowed a creature this magnificent. Yet the wolf remained perfectly still, watching her with patient silver eyes that seemed almost amused. "There," she whispered as she tied the final knot. "You're going to be just fine." His ears twitched. His heavy tail thumped against the porch once, then twice. Emily laughed under her breath. "You really like the attention, don't you?" The wolf answered with a low, content rumble that vibrated through the cool morning air. It was strange. Every other wild animal she treated fled the instant it felt strong enough. Injured foxes disappeared before sunrise. Hawks returned to the sky without looking back. Even frightened deer refused to stay longer than necessary. But this wolf lingered every single time, lying near her cabin until she finished her morning tea before quietly disappearing into the endless forest. Emily gathered her herbs and placed the empty glass bottle back onto the wooden shelf beside her door. Lavender, yarrow, comfrey. The familiar scents wrapped around the tiny cabin she had called home for almost 4 years. Most people avoided the place. They called her odd, a lonely omega who preferred injured animals to pack gatherings. Some whispered she had wasted the moon goddess's gift by refusing to become a healer for wolves. Others insisted something was wrong with any woman who smiled more often at stray creatures than at people. Emily had stopped caring a long time ago. Animals never lied. They never mocked weakness. They never measured someone's worth by rank or bloodline. They simply hurt, trusted, healed, and moved on. That made sense to her. She reached out and gently scratched behind the wolf's ear. His massive head leaned into her hand with surprising gentleness. "You know," she said softly, "I don't even know what to call you." His eyes remained locked on hers. Calm, intelligent, almost human in the way they seemed to listen instead of merely hear. "How about Shadow?" she suggested. One ear flicked. "No." She smiled again. "Midnight." The wolf blinked slowly. Still no. A warm breeze drifted through the trees, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and distant rain. Somewhere far away, church bells from the nearest village echoed faintly across the hills. Emily stood and brushed the dirt from her apron. "Well, mysterious stranger, I suppose you'll disappear again until the next accident." The wolf rose gracefully onto all fours. For one impossible second, he hesitated, almost as though he wanted to stay. Then he stepped backward toward the tree line, never breaking eye contact. Emily folded her arms and shook her head with an amused sigh. "Try not to find another bush to trip over." The wolf paused. If wolves could look guilty, this one certainly did. Then, with one powerful leap, he vanished between the towering pines, leaving only faint paw prints in the damp soil. Emily watched until the forest swallowed every trace of him. She smiled to herself and returned inside, never noticing another set of footprints hidden beyond the trees. They were not paw prints. They belonged to a man wearing polished black boots, standing silently in the shadows where the morning light could not quite reach. He waited until Emily closed her cabin door before letting out a long, defeated breath. "You're embarrassing both of us," he murmured toward the empty forest with the weary affection of someone losing an argument he had never intended to fight. Somewhere deep among the pines, a distant wolf answered with a satisfied howl. The little cabin returned to its familiar silence after the black wolf disappeared into the forest, and Emily Carter quietly slipped back into the rhythm that had become her entire world. She filled a dented kettle with fresh spring water, scattered dried chamomile into a worn ceramic cup, and opened every window to welcome the cool mountain air drifting through the pines. The scent of crushed herbs mixed with cedar wood and rain-soaked earth, creating the comforting fragrance that every injured creature seemed to recognize before they ever reached her porch. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with neatly labeled jars filled with leaves, roots, flowers, and carefully ground powders collected over countless seasons. Every bundle hanging from the rafters represented another lesson taught by nature instead of people. Emily preferred it that way. The forest had never laughed when she made mistakes. It simply gave her another chance to learn. Years earlier, when she had still lived among her pack, everyone expected an Omega to dedicate her gift to wolves alone. They believed healing should strengthen the pack first, then everyone else. Emily had quietly disagreed. Pain did not care about rank, bloodline, or species. A frightened rabbit hiding beneath a fallen log deserved comfort just as much as an injured wolf. That belief had earned puzzled looks at first, disappointed sighs later, and eventually complete silence. By the time she packed her few belongings and settled beside the forest, hardly anyone tried to stop her. They simply assumed she would return after discovering how lonely the wilderness could become. She never did. A soft scratching sound interrupted her thoughts. Emily smiled before turning toward the back door. A small red fox stood patiently outside, its fluffy tail wrapped neatly around its paws as though waiting for an appointment. "Come on in, Rusty," she said as she opened the door. The fox trotted inside without hesitation and hopped onto the familiar blanket beside the fireplace. Emily gently examined one tiny paw where a thorn had become lodged between the pads. "You really have to start watching where you step," she whispered. Rusty blinked innocently, making her laugh again. Moments like these reminded her why she had chosen this life. There were no arguments, no judgments, no whispered conversations behind her back, only quiet trust. After removing the thorn and offering the fox a small piece of dried venison, she watched him disappear happily into the trees. The afternoon sun slowly crossed the windows, filling the cabin with warm golden light. Emily stepped onto the porch carrying a basket filled with freshly washed bandages, spreading them across a wooden railing to dry. From the top of the nearby hill, she noticed riders moving along the distant road. Their horses were tall, their cloaks dark, and polished armor flashed beneath the sunlight before disappearing behind another line of trees. Royal patrols had become more frequent during recent weeks. Villagers whispered that the Alpha King rarely left his capital without reason, though no one seemed to know what had changed. Emily paid little attention to politics. Kings belonged in castles. She belonged here. Even so, an unfamiliar feeling settled quietly in her chest as she watched the riders vanish beyond the ridge. It was not fear. It was curiosity, gentle and impossible to explain. That evening she prepared another small jar of healing salve before placing it beside the front door without thinking. Only after blowing out the last lantern did she realize she had made enough medicine for one patient she had not actually expected. She looked toward the dark forest outside her window and smiled at herself. "You are not coming back tomorrow," she whispered. Somewhere beyond the moonlit pines, a familiar howl answered almost immediately, warm, playful, and impossibly close. The next morning arrived wrapped in silver mist, and Emily Carter woke before sunrise with the odd certainty that someone would be waiting outside. She shook her head at the foolish thought while tying her hair back with a faded blue ribbon. "You really are spending too much time alone," she whispered to herself as she opened the front door. There he was. The enormous black wolf sat politely beside the porch, looking almost proud of himself. Emily folded her arms and stared at him. "You cannot be serious." The wolf slowly lifted one front paw. A tiny briar thorn had become tangled between the thick fur near one claw. It was hardly an injury at all. Emily walked down the porch steps and crouched beside him, carefully removing the thorn with the tips of her fingers. "That is it?" she asked. "This was your emergency?" The wolf blinked once, completely unashamed. She could not help smiling. "You walked nearly 3 miles through the forest because of this." His tail brushed gently across the grass. "You know," she continued while brushing loose dirt from his paw, "most wild animals try very hard to avoid people." The wolf leaned forward until his broad head rested lightly against her shoulder for only a brief second before pulling away again. Emily froze. The gesture felt strangely familiar, as though someone she had forgotten had once comforted her exactly the same way. She quickly dismissed the thought. Memories could be misleading when loneliness lingered too long. She returned inside to wash her hands, expecting the wolf to disappear as usual. Instead, when she stepped back onto the porch carrying a small bowl of fresh water, he was still there, patiently watching every movement she made. You really do not know how to leave, do you? She laughed. During the following week, the pattern repeated itself so consistently that Emily could almost predict the hour of his arrival. One morning, he appeared with a tiny scratch near one ear after apparently forcing his way through thick brush. 2 days later, he arrived limping dramatically, only for Emily to discover that a small pebble had become stuck between his paw pads. Another afternoon, she found a burr tangled in the long fur beneath his neck, and he stood perfectly still while she patiently worked it free. Every single time she finished treating him, he looked noticeably healthier than when he arrived, almost as if the discomfort had never been serious to begin with. Midnight, she sighed one cool afternoon, finally deciding upon the name despite his earlier refusal. Either you have the worst luck in the entire forest, or you are doing something incredibly silly. The wolf lowered his head, refusing to meet her eyes for the first time. Emily narrowed her gaze. That looked suspicious. He answered by sneezing softly, earning another laugh she had not expected. It had been years since laughter came this easily. Meanwhile, far beyond the forest, the grand halls of Ashford Keep buzzed with quiet concern. Servants whispered that their alpha king had once again postponed another council meeting. Advisors exchanged puzzled glances when Alexander Ashford arrived several minutes late, a fresh scratch running across the back of one hand. Your Majesty, one elderly counselor asked carefully. Perhaps the royal physician should examine that. Alexander glanced briefly at the faint mark before calmly pulling on a leather glove. It is nothing, he replied. His expression remained perfectly composed, but somewhere deep inside, another presence radiated unmistakable satisfaction. Before the meeting even ended, a single thought echoed through his mind with relentless determination. Tomorrow. Go back tomorrow. By the end of the second week, Emily Carter had begun measuring time in unexpected ways. Mondays no longer mattered. Neither did market days or the changing weather. Instead, her mornings were quietly divided into two possibilities. Either the mysterious black wolf appeared before breakfast, or he arrived just before sunset wearing another expression that somehow managed to look both dignified and terribly guilty. On one crisp autumn morning, she found him sitting beside her herb garden with a single twig tangled in the thick fur of his tail. She stared at him for several long seconds before setting down the basket she had been carrying. Absolutely not, she said, trying very hard to sound serious. There is no chance that happened by accident. The wolf slowly turned his head away as though the distant mountains had suddenly become fascinating. Emily laughed despite herself. You are pretending not to hear me. She carefully untangled the branch while the enormous animal remained perfectly still, almost looking pleased with the extra attention. Once she finished, he leaned forward and gently bumped the side of her arm with his nose. You are impossible, she whispered, scratching beneath his chin. And you know exactly how to win an argument. Later that afternoon, Emily traveled into the nearby village to exchange dried herbs for flour, lamp oil, and fresh sewing thread. The marketplace was small, crowded with familiar faces and wooden stalls overflowing with apples, honey, handmade candles, and baskets woven from willow branches. She preferred visiting during the quieter hours, yet people still noticed her. Some greeted her warmly because she had once saved an injured farm horse or nursed a family dog back to health. Others simply watched from a distance with polite curiosity. Emily called Mrs. Harper, the elderly baker, handing her a warm loaf wrapped in cloth. You have been spending even more time in the woods lately. Emily smiled. The forest has been unusually busy. Mrs. Harper chuckled. Busy with animals? Emily hesitated for only a heartbeat. Mostly one very stubborn wolf. The baker's smile slowly faded into thoughtful silence. Black fur? She asked quietly. Emily nodded. Silver eyes? Another nod. Mrs. Harper glanced around before lowering her voice. My grandfather used to tell stories about a wolf like that when I was little. He believed every alpha king shared one soul, with a wolf powerful enough to wander the forest even when no human eyes were watching. They said those wolves chose where they wished to go, regardless of what their human half wanted. Emily laughed softly. That sounds like one of those bedtime stories meant to keep children indoors. Perhaps. Mrs. Harper smiled again. But old stories usually begin somewhere close to the truth. The conversation lingered in Emily's thoughts throughout the walk home. She had never believed much in legends. Plants healed because they contained natural remedies. Animals trusted because patience earned trust. Life was usually simpler than the tales people invented. And yet, she remembered the wolf's unusually intelligent gaze, the almost human patience in his movements, and the strange feeling that he understood every word she spoke. By the time she reached her cabin, dusk had settled gently across the forest. A familiar figure already waited beside the porch, sitting exactly where the evening light painted his black coat with streaks of gold. Emily placed both hands on her hips and narrowed her eyes. "Do not tell me," she sighed with exaggerated disappointment. "You found another life-threatening leaf today." The wolf slowly lifted one paw. Resting between two claws was nothing more than a tiny pine needle. Emily stared at him before shaking her head in surrender. "I officially think you are doing this on purpose." For the very first time since he had entered her life, the wolf lowered his head, and if a wolf could possibly smile, she would have sworn that he did. The following morning unfolded beneath a sky the color of pale silver, and Emily Carter had barely finished hanging bundles of fresh mint to dry when an unfamiliar sound drifted up the narrow trail leading to her cabin. It was not the quiet tread of deer or the playful chatter of foxes. It was the steady rhythm of horses walking with practiced discipline. Emily stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron as three riders emerged from between the towering pines. Their dark cloaks were embroidered with the crest of the royal household, though none of them carried themselves with unnecessary arrogance. The man at the front removed one leather glove before offering a respectful nod. "Miss Carter," he asked. Emily answered with a cautious smile. "That depends on who is asking. My name is Nathan Brooks. I serve the royal household. We have heard remarkable stories about your skill with injured animals." Emily glanced toward the stable where a pair of bluebirds had built a nest beneath the roof. "People enjoy exaggerating." Nathan shook his head gently. "Not in this case." He opened a polished wooden chest carried behind his saddle. Inside rested neatly stacked gold coins, far more money than Emily had ever seen in one place. "His Majesty wishes to purchase every jar of healing salve, every dried herb, and every medicinal supply you are willing to sell. We will gladly pay whatever price you name." Emily looked from the chest to the quiet forest surrounding her little home. The offer could repair her roof, replace every cracked window, and provide enough supplies to last several winters. Yet something inside her hesitated before logic could speak. "May I ask why?" Nathan answered honestly. "The royal kennels care for many hunting hounds, messenger wolves, and rescued creatures from across the kingdom. Reliable medicine has become difficult to find." Emily considered his words. They sounded reasonable, but another thought lingered quietly beneath the surface. If she sold everything today, what would she have left for the injured creatures that wandered to her porch tomorrow? She closed the wooden chest with gentle hands. "I am honored that the palace thought of me," she said softly, "but I cannot accept." Nathan blinked in surprise. "Perhaps the payment is insufficient." "It is more than generous." Emily smiled kindly. "The forest depends on these remedies as much as any castle. If I empty my shelves, the next injured animal that comes searching for help will find nothing waiting." Silence settled over the clearing. Even the horses seemed unusually still. Nathan studied her expression for a long moment before slowly nodding. Very few people refuse the Alpha King's generosity. Emily shrugged lightly. "I am not refusing kindness. I am protecting a promise I made to myself a long time ago." Nathan bowed his head with genuine respect. "Then I will tell His Majesty exactly that." As the riders disappeared back into the trees, Emily released a quiet breath she had not realized she had been holding. The decision had felt strangely important, though she could not explain why. That evening, just as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the mountains, the familiar black wolf appeared once again at the edge of the clearing. This time there was no scratch on his ears, no pebble between his paws, and no tangled branch caught in his fur. He simply stood there watching her with calm silver eyes. Emily crossed her arms with playful suspicion. "Well, this is new." The wolf slowly walked toward her until he reached the bottom step of the porch. Then, instead of lifting an injured paw, he gently placed a single wildflower at her feet. Emily stared at the tiny white blossom before looking back into those impossibly thoughtful eyes. A smile spread across her face without permission. "You came all this way, just to bring me a flower?" The wolf lowered his head ever so slightly, And somewhere, beyond the trees, hidden where neither of them could see, Nathan Brooks quietly watched before whispering to himself with a helpless smile, "Your Majesty, I do not believe she has any idea what she is doing to you." Emily Carter placed the tiny white flower inside a small glass bottle on her kitchen window, and every time the afternoon breeze stirred its delicate petals, she found herself smiling without realizing it. The mysterious gift remained fresh for days, almost impossibly so, as though the forest itself refused to let it fade. The following morning, she prepared fresh salve, sorted dried herbs into labeled jars, and waited without admitting to herself that she was waiting. Sure enough, just after the sun climbed above the tallest pines, familiar footsteps rustled through the leaves. The great black wolf emerged from the trees carrying himself with the same quiet confidence he always had, except today, he favored his left shoulder ever so slightly. Emily stepped off the porch with a gentle sigh. "Let me guess," she said. "Another terrible emergency." The wolf sat obediently in front of her. She brushed her fingers through the thick fur covering his shoulder until she discovered a narrow scrape hidden beneath his coat. It was real, though so small that most creatures would have ignored it entirely. Emily cleaned the mark with warm water, spread a thin layer of herbal salve across it, and wrapped a light linen bandage around the area. "You know," she whispered while tying the knot, "I am beginning to think you simply enjoy my company." The wolf looked directly into her eyes without blinking. There was something almost startling about the silence between them now. It no longer felt like a woman caring for a wild animal. It felt like two lonely souls sharing a conversation that somehow needed no words at all. Emily reached for another strip of cloth before pausing. Her brows slowly drew together. "That is strange." Yesterday, while brushing the wolf's thick coat after removing a few loose burrs, she had noticed an older scar crossing the same shoulder. It had been pale, smooth, and unmistakable beneath the fur. Today the scar had vanished completely. Emily leaned closer, carefully parting the black fur again. Nothing remained except healthy skin beneath the dense coat. She blinked once, then twice. "I know what I saw," she murmured quietly. The wolf tilted his head, watching every expression cross her face. Emily gently touched the place where the scar should have been. There was no swelling, no rough skin, not even a faint line. It was as though time itself had quietly erased the wound overnight. "Animals heal quickly," she reminded herself aloud. But not that quickly. She stepped back, studying the enormous creature with fresh curiosity. Over the past several weeks, every scrape, every thorn, every tiny cut seemed to disappear far faster than nature should allow. She had dismissed it at first because healthy wolves recovered well, yet now the pattern was impossible to ignore. The wolf slowly stood and gave his shoulder an experimental stretch. The fresh bandage remained perfectly in place. Then, almost proudly, he took several smooth steps across the clearing before glancing back at her, as if asking whether she approved. Emily laughed softly despite the questions filling her mind. "You are either the healthiest patient in the entire kingdom," she said, "or you are keeping a very interesting secret." Deep within the royal palace, at nearly that exact moment, Alexander Ashford paused in front of a tall mirror while fastening the cuff of his dark coat. His personal attendant frowned slightly. "Your Majesty," he said with genuine confusion, "I distinctly remember bandaging your shoulder this morning." Alexander glanced toward the mirror. The bandage was gone. Beneath it, the skin was already perfectly healed. Before either man could speak again, the Alpha King felt a familiar warmth stir quietly inside his chest, followed by an unmistakable feeling of contentment that did not belong entirely to him. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, hidden among endless pines, his wolf was smiling again. Emily Carter could not stop thinking about the disappearing scar. Every logical explanation she offered herself seemed reasonable for a few minutes before quietly falling apart. Wolves healed quickly. Healthy animals recovered faster than people. Nature often surprised those willing to watch it closely. Yet none of those truths explained why an old scar had simply ceased to exist. 2 mornings later, she decided to test nothing at all and simply observe. The black wolf arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying no obvious injury, no tangled branches, and no dramatic limp. He walked with calm confidence until he reached the porch, then settled onto the grass as though visiting an old friend rather than a healer. Emily leaned against the porch railing with a knowing smile. You do realize, she said, that today I cannot find a single reason for you to be here. The wolf blinked once, completely unbothered by her accusation. She laughed softly and carried her basket into the herb garden, expecting him to wander away after growing bored. Instead, he followed at a respectful distance, never crowding her, simply watching as she harvested rosemary, mint, and echinacea beneath the warm autumn sun. Whenever she moved to another garden bed, he quietly stood and followed again. When she knelt beside a patch of lavender, he lay down in the shade nearby. It became almost impossible not to notice. You are supervising me now? She asked with amused disbelief. His ears lifted slightly at the sound of her voice. Well, she continued, if you are going to spend the day here, you might as well make yourself useful. She handed him a small woven basket as a joke, fully expecting it to fall harmlessly onto the grass. Instead, the wolf carefully caught the handle between his teeth without damaging the basket at all. Emily stared at him in surprise. You understood that. The wolf calmly carried the empty basket behind her while she collected herbs, looking so remarkably proud of his assignment that she burst into genuine laughter. The sound echoed through the clearing, bright and effortless, lingering among the pine trees longer than either of them expected. Hidden several hundred yards away atop a rocky overlook, Nathan Brooks lowered the small brass spyglass he had reluctantly accepted from the palace armory. He rubbed one hand across his face before looking toward the silent man standing beside him. Alexander Ashford remained motionless, dressed in a simple traveling cloak instead of royal attire, his silver eyes fixed entirely on the tiny cabin below. Your Majesty, Nathan said carefully, with complete respect, I have served you for 12 years. Alexander nodded slightly. You have. Nathan hesitated before continuing. I have seen you negotiate peace between rival packs, settle border disputes without raising your voice, and face rooms full of nobles who feared your decisions. I have never once seen you smile. Alexander remained silent. Nathan looked back through the spyglass toward the clearing where Emily was pretending to scold the enormous wolf for stealing one of her gardening gloves. You are smiling now. Alexander did not deny it. The faint expression remained at the corner of his mouth, quiet enough that most people would never notice it. She laughs, he answered at last. My wolf likes hearing it. Nathan slowly lowered the spyglass again. Respectfully, Your Majesty, I believe it is not only your wolf. Far below them, Emily finally retrieved her glove after the black wolf playfully nudged it toward her feet with one careful paw. She reached forward without thinking and rested her hand against the side of his face. Neither of them moved. For one peaceful moment, the entire forest seemed to fall completely silent, as though even the wind had paused to witness something neither heart was quite ready to understand. Several peaceful days passed without anything unusual happening, and that alone made Emily Carter suspicious. The mysterious black wolf still visited every morning, still followed her through the herb garden with quiet devotion, and still found increasingly ridiculous reasons to ask for her attention. One afternoon he appeared with his thick fur dripping from nose to tail, leaving tiny puddles across the wooden porch. Emily looked from the soaked wolf to the clear blue sky overhead. It has not rained in 3 days, she said slowly. The wolf lowered his ears with theatrical innocence. Emily walked to the edge of the porch and glanced toward the nearby creek winding through the forest. The water sparkled brightly beneath the afternoon sun. She turned back toward him, narrowing her eyes. You jumped into the creek on purpose, did not you? The wolf blinked once. She folded her arms. You absolutely did. A quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Come here. He obeyed immediately. Emily disappeared inside the cabin and returned carrying several thick towels that she usually reserved for rescued dogs after heavy storms. She draped one across his broad shoulders and began rubbing the damp fur dry with slow, patient movements. The wolf remained perfectly still, occasionally closing his eyes as though the simple care brought him more comfort than the warmth itself. You are the strangest patient I have ever met, Emily whispered. Healthy enough to outrun every deer in these woods, yet somehow unable to avoid falling into perfectly harmless streams. The wolf responded with a soft rumble that sounded suspiciously pleased. Emily gently dried the fur around his ears before noticing tiny droplets clinging to his whiskers. "Hold still," she said. "You missed a spot." She reached up with one hand, brushing away the last drops of water. For the briefest moment, her fingertips rested against the side of his face again. Something unexpected happened. A strange warmth spread through her palm, gentle rather than startling, almost like sunlight reaching through cold morning mist. It lasted only a heartbeat before disappearing completely. Emily slowly withdrew her hand, quietly puzzled. The wolf opened his silver eyes and looked at her with such unmistakable tenderness that she forgot to ask herself what she had just felt. "You really do enjoy this, do not you?" she asked with a smile. He nudged the folded towel with his nose, asking for more. Emily laughed so hard she nearly dropped it. "Unbelievable. You are asking for another turn." She continued drying him while talking about everything and nothing at once, telling him which herbs would need harvesting before the first frost, complaining that squirrels kept stealing walnuts from her basket, and wondering aloud whether foxes secretly held meetings every night just to plan new mischief. The wolf listened with complete attention, his ears turning toward her every time she spoke. Hidden inside that quiet companionship, the hours slipped by unnoticed. Far away in Ashford Keep, Nathan Brooks stood outside the council chamber, holding another stack of documents that required the Alpha King's signature. The doors remained closed longer than expected. When Alexander Ashford finally entered the room, one sleeve of his dark coat appeared slightly damp. Nathan glanced outside where bright sunshine covered the palace gardens without a single cloud in sight. He looked back toward his king with growing disbelief. "Your Majesty," he asked carefully, "may I ask whether the royal gardens have suddenly developed a lake?" Alexander paused for only an instant before answering with perfect composure. "Not that I am aware of." Nathan nodded slowly. "Of course." He waited until the Alpha King walked past before quietly adding under his breath, "Then someone else has apparently discovered one." Alexander almost smiled again, and somewhere deep within his soul another contented feeling echoed back, carrying the memory of warm towels, gentle hands, and the sound of one woman's laughter filling an entire forest. The first full moon of autumn rose slowly above the endless pine forest, bathing Emily Carter's little cabin in soft silver light that transformed every leaf and stone into something quietly magical. She had always loved nights like this. Injured animals often felt calmer beneath the moon, and the forest itself seemed to breathe more gently after sunset. Emily finished placing fresh herbs inside glass jars before carrying a small lantern onto the porch. She smiled when she noticed the familiar black wolf already waiting beneath the old maple tree, his dark coat glowing with pale strands of moonlight. "You are early tonight," she whispered. The wolf rose immediately and walked beside her as she wandered toward the small creek where she often collected fresh water. Neither of them hurried. The only sounds came from flowing water, rustling branches, and the occasional call of an owl somewhere high above the trees. Emily filled her wooden bucket and looked at the wolf standing only a few feet away. "Do you ever get tired?" she asked with a quiet laugh. "You visit almost every day, and somehow you always know exactly where to find me." The wolf simply watched her, his silver eyes reflecting the moon so perfectly that they almost seemed to shine from within. Emily felt that familiar strange warmth in her chest again, the same peaceful feeling that had become impossible to ignore. They slowly began walking back toward the cabin together, but halfway through the clearing the wolf suddenly stopped. His ears lifted. His gaze shifted toward the distant mountains. Emily followed his line of sight, but saw nothing except moonlit trees stretching across the horizon. "What is it?" she asked softly. The wolf remained perfectly still for another long moment before taking 2 careful steps backward. Emily frowned. Every evening, he usually lingered beside the porch until she closed the door for the night. Tonight felt different. Without warning, he turned and disappeared between the towering pines, moving faster than she had ever seen him run. "Wait," Emily called instinctively, surprised by the disappointment in her own voice. The forest swallowed him almost instantly. She stood alone beneath the moon, listening to the silence he had left behind. Something urged her to follow. She hesitated only briefly before lifting the lantern and carefully walking after the faint tracks leading deeper into the woods. The trail was easy to follow at first. Massive paw prints pressed into soft earth guided her between ancient trees and over moss-covered stones. Then, quite suddenly, they stopped. Emily lowered the lantern, puzzled. The paw prints ended in the middle of a narrow clearing without continuing in any direction. She slowly searched the ground again. Nothing. No signs of another animal. No returning tracks. It was as though the great wolf had simply vanished into thin air. A cool breeze stirred the branches overhead, carrying another sound from somewhere beyond the trees. Hoofbeats. Emily instinctively stepped behind the trunk of a large pine as several riders approached along an old forest path. At their center rode a tall man wearing a dark traveling cloak with the hood lowered. Moonlight briefly illuminated his face. Dark hair rested against the collar of his coat, and calm silver eyes scanned the quiet forest before him. For the smallest fraction of a second, those eyes turned toward the very clearing where Emily stood hidden. Her breath caught. They were the exact same shade of silver she had looked into every single day for weeks. Before she could understand why that impossible thought had entered her mind, the riders continued onward, disappearing through the trees as quietly as they had arrived. Emily slowly stepped back into the clearing and looked once more at the place where the paw prints had ended. Her heart whispered something her mind refused to believe, and for the first time since meeting the mysterious wolf, she found herself wondering whether the greatest secret in the forest had never belonged to the forest at all. Emily Carter slept very little after the strange events beneath the full moon. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the clearing where the enormous paw prints had simply ended and remembered the silver-eyed stranger riding through the forest only moments later. She tried to convince herself it had been nothing more than coincidence. The world was full of coincidences, yet the thought refused to leave her. The next morning arrived unusually quiet. No familiar footsteps crossed the clearing. No patient waited beneath the maple tree. Emily finished watering her herb garden, sorted dried flowers into fresh bundles, and found herself glancing toward the forest far more often than she cared to admit. "You really spoiled me," she murmured with a small smile that slowly faded as the hours passed. By late afternoon, a gentle knock echoed across the porch. Emily opened the door expecting another villager needing medicine for a farm animal. Instead, she found Nathan Brooks standing politely beside a tall man dressed in a simple charcoal traveling coat without royal markings. His dark hair rested neatly against his collar, and although dust from the forest trail covered his boots, nothing about him felt ordinary. He carried himself with effortless confidence, yet his expression remained calm and unexpectedly kind. "Miss Carter," Nathan said with a respectful nod. "Forgive the unannounced visit. My companion suffered a minor scrape while traveling through the woods, and I remembered your generosity." Emily looked toward the stranger. "I only treat those willing to sit still," she replied lightly. A faint smile touched the man's face. "I have been told I can follow instructions." His voice was deep, warm, and strangely familiar. Emily invited them inside without another question. Sunlight poured through the windows, filling the cabin with the comforting scent of dried lavender and cedar. The stranger removed his coat and rolled back one sleeve. A narrow scrape crossed his forearm, clean and shallow, hardly requiring much attention. Emily gathered warm water and fresh cloth before gently cleaning the mark. "You were fortunate," she said while applying a thin layer of salve. "Another inch, and the branch could have cut much deeper." "So I have been told," he answered, watching her work with quiet attention rather than the wound itself. Emily reached for a bandage, and as she wrapped the cloth around his arm, her eyes drifted briefly toward the back of his hand. Her breath caught. A faint pale line rested across his knuckles. She knew that scar. Only a few days earlier, she had brushed herbal salve across an almost identical mark hidden beneath thick black fur. Her fingers paused for the smallest fraction of a second before continuing the bandage exactly as before. She said nothing. When she finished, the stranger flexed his hand once before smiling. "You have remarkable hands." Emily looked up, unexpectedly meeting his eyes. Silver. Not gray. Not blue. True silver that reflected the afternoon light exactly the way another pair of eyes always had. The room suddenly felt very still. Outside, a breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging beneath the porch roof. Nathan quietly looked toward the window, pretending not to notice the silence stretching between them. Emily slowly stepped back, studying the man before her with growing uncertainty. the calm way he watched her, the familiar warmth she felt standing near him, the impossible color of his eyes. Then another memory returned with startling clarity. The black wolf had rested his head against her shoulder in exactly the same gentle way this man now inclined his head while thanking her. It was not proof. It could not possibly be proof. And yet her heart whispered the same impossible thought it had begun repeating beneath the moonlit trees. The stranger accepted his coat and paused beside the doorway. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said softly. "I have a feeling I will see you again." Emily watched him disappear down the forest path beside Nathan Brooks, and only after they vanished between the pines did she realize something that sent a quiet shiver through her entire body. Neither man had ever asked for directions to her cabin. They had already known exactly where to find her. Emily Carter spent the next 2 days trying to convince herself that she had imagined the similarities. Silver eyes could belong to more than one person. A scar could resemble another scar. Familiar gestures could simply be coincidence. She repeated those thoughts while grinding dried herbs into fine powder, while sweeping the porch, and while feeding the curious birds that gathered outside her window every morning. None of the explanations brought her any peace. What troubled her most was not the mysterious traveler himself. It was the absence that followed. The black wolf did not return the next morning, nor the morning after that. The clearing outside her cabin remained strangely empty, and for the first time since their unusual friendship began, Emily caught herself listening for footsteps that never came. She smiled sadly at her own impatience. "You finally found something more interesting than me," she whispered toward the silent forest. Even as she said the words, they felt wrong. Late on the third afternoon, she carried a basket of fresh herbs toward the creek, hoping the familiar walk would quiet her restless thoughts. The forest welcomed her with gentle wind and golden leaves drifting lazily across the narrow trail. Everything looked exactly the same, yet something felt different. Then she noticed them. Fresh paw prints. Large. Perfectly familiar. Emily slowly knelt beside the trail, gently tracing one print with her fingertips. "You are here," she murmured. Instead of returning home, she quietly followed the tracks deeper into the woods. They curved between ancient pines before leading into a peaceful meadow where afternoon sunlight spilled across tall grass like liquid gold. At the center of the meadow stood the great black wolf. He was watching her as though he had known she would come. Relief washed across Emily before she could hide it. "There you are," she breathed. "Do you have any idea how worried I have been?" The wolf walked toward her with slow, careful steps. There was no limp, no scratch, no tangled branch waiting to be removed. He simply stopped close enough that she could rest one hand against the side of his neck. Emily smiled and gently brushed her fingers through his thick fur. "You do not have a single excuse today." The wolf lowered his head slightly, almost apologetically. She laughed under her breath. "I think you missed me." His tail swept once across the grass. Emily looked into his silver eyes, and the strange certainty inside her became impossible to ignore. "Tell me something," she whispered. "Why do your eyes remind me of someone else?" The wolf did not move. He simply held her gaze with quiet patience. The afternoon breeze lifted a strand of Emily's hair across her face. Before she could brush it aside, the wolf gently nudged it away with the tip of his nose. The thoughtful gesture was so unmistakably familiar that Emily felt her heart skip. She had seen the traveler perform the very same movement only days earlier when a loose branch had drifted toward her while she bandaged his arm. Different forms. The exact same instinct. Emily slowly stepped backward, her breathing suddenly unsteady. "It cannot be," she whispered, though she no longer sounded certain. The wolf remained completely still. There was no fear in his eyes. No attempt to leave. Only quiet hope. Far beyond the meadow, hidden where neither of them could see, Nathan Brooks stood beside Alexander Ashford's riderless horse. He looked toward the open field and sighed with gentle resignation. "Your Majesty," he murmured to the empty air, knowing exactly where his king truly was. "I believe secrets only survive until the heart becomes brave enough to recognize them." Emily Carter stood motionless in the quiet meadow, her hand still resting against the thick black fur beneath her fingertips. The breeze carried the scent of pine, wildflowers, and the faint sweetness of autumn leaves, yet all she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. The wolf never looked away. His silver eyes held no fear, only an almost heartbreaking patience. as though he had been waiting for this exact moment far longer than she could imagine. Emily slowly exhaled. "I think I know," she whispered, though the words barely reached the space between them. "I just do not know how it could possibly be true." The wolf stepped closer until only inches separated them. She gently cupped the side of his face with both hands, studying every familiar detail she had somehow overlooked before. The calm expression, the thoughtful pauses before every movement, the quiet habit of tilting his head whenever she spoke. Even the way he seemed happiest simply watching her smile. None of those belonged to instinct alone. They belonged to someone she had already met. Tears gathered unexpectedly in Emily's eyes, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that every impossible clue had quietly been waiting for her to notice. "You were never pretending to understand me," she murmured. "You truly did." The wolf slowly closed his eyes beneath her touch, leaning into her hands exactly as he always had. The gesture answered more than words ever could. At that same moment, deep within the silent chambers of Ashford Keep, Alexander Ashford sat alone in his private study. Several unsigned documents remained scattered across the polished desk before him, untouched for nearly an hour. Nathan Brooks entered quietly, carrying another stack of reports before stopping when he noticed the distant expression on his king's face. "She knows," Nathan said softly. Alexander did not ask how he knew. Instead, he gave the smallest nod. "Not everything," he answered, "but enough." Nathan rested the papers on the desk. "Then perhaps it is time to tell her the truth." Alexander's silver eyes drifted toward the window overlooking the endless forest beyond the palace walls. "The truth is more complicated than she deserves." Nathan smiled gently. "Or perhaps it is simpler than you fear." Alexander remained silent for several moments before finally speaking the words he had never admitted aloud to anyone. "It was never my decision." Nathan looked at him with quiet confusion. Alexander's expression softened in a way almost no one had ever witnessed. "The first morning my wolf found her cabin, I intended to leave immediately. There was no reason for the Alpha King to linger near an unknown healer living alone in the woods." He paused, remembering. "My wolf refused." Nathan raised one eyebrow. Alexander actually smiled. "The next day I ordered myself to stay away." He let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Instead, my wolf deliberately pushed through thorn bushes until he had an excuse to return." Nathan could not help smiling as well. "The scratches." Alexander nodded. "The tangled branches. The pebbles between his paws. Even the creak." He shook his head with affectionate surrender. "I did not fake those injuries. My wolf created them because he wanted to see her again." Nathan stared in astonishment before laughing softly for the first time in years. "Your Majesty, the most powerful alpha in the kingdom has been losing arguments to his own wolf." Alexander accepted the truth with quiet dignity. "Every single one." Far away beneath the fading afternoon light, Emily wrapped both arms around the great black wolf's neck without another word. The wolf rested his head gently against her shoulder, and in that peaceful embrace, both of them finally understood something neither had been brave enough to admit before. Long before the Alpha King recognized the woman destined to change his life, his wolf had already chosen her with his whole heart. The sun slipped gently below the mountains, covering the quiet meadow in warm shades of amber and gold as Emily Carter slowly loosened her embrace. The great black wolf remained close, his silver eyes never leaving hers, as though he feared that if he looked away the fragile truth between them might disappear with the fading light. Emily smiled through the tears still shimmering in her eyes and brushed one hand across the soft fur beneath his jaw. "You spent all this time finding excuses to come back," she whispered. "Not because you needed a healer." The wolf lowered his head slightly. "Because you did not want to be alone." The words were spoken almost as a question, yet something deep inside her already knew the answer. A gentle breeze swept across the meadow, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers while the first evening stars appeared overhead. Emily took one slow step backward. "I think it is time for me to stop pretending that none of this is real." The wolf watched her quietly. Then, before her eyes, he turned toward the edge of the meadow and walked calmly into the gathering shadows beneath the trees. Emily did not follow. She simply waited. Moments later, another figure stepped back into the fading light. Alexander Ashford stood where the wolf had disappeared only seconds before, dressed in the same simple traveling clothes she had seen before, his silver eyes holding the same warmth she had come to recognize long before she understood why. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them felt peaceful rather than uncertain, as though every unanswered question had already found its place. Alexander stopped a respectful distance away. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not for meeting you, but for allowing you to search for answers alone." Emily looked at him for a long moment before smiling with gentle amusement. "You certainly made it difficult." A faint laugh escaped him. "I know." She folded her arms lightly. "So tell me something honestly." He nodded. "Anything." Emily tilted her head, remembering every tiny scrape, every harmless thorn, every soaked afternoon beside the creek, and every ridiculous excuse that had brought a certain black wolf back to her porch. How many of those injuries were actually accidents? Alexander looked down for a brief moment before meeting her eyes again with complete sincerity. "Very few." Emily tried to remain serious, but her smile grew wider anyway. "I knew it." Alexander shook his head. With quiet affection. "You misunderstand." She raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" I never asked him to return. His expression softened. "Every time I decided it was wiser to stay away, my wolf found another reason to visit you. He ignored my pride, my responsibilities, and every sensible decision I tried to make." Emily laughed, the sound echoing gently through the meadow. "So the mighty Alpha King lost an argument." Alexander smiled fully for the first time. Repeatedly, they stood together beneath the evening sky, two people whose lives had quietly changed long before either of them understood why. Emily stepped closer and reached for his hand. He accepted it with gentle care, just as naturally as though it had always belonged there. She looked into the familiar silver eyes that had watched over her in two different forms and smiled with playful tenderness. "You know," she said softly, "I always told everyone that I only healed animals." Alexander's smile warmed even further. "I remember." Emily gave his hand a gentle squeeze. It turns out the only patient who truly needed healing was the man sharing a heart with one very stubborn wolf. Above them, somewhere beyond the treetops, a lone wolf offered a peaceful howl that drifted across the forest like a promise carried on the wind. And from that evening forward, no scratches, tangled branches, or unnecessary visits were ever needed again, because neither of them had another reason to hide what had been true from the very beginning.